6,000 years ago, in a strip of land between two rivers, a group of people did something no human beings had ever done before. They invented writing, not just writing. They invented the wheel, the first law codes, the first cities, the first courts, the first schools, the first beer recipes, written down, because apparently even civilization's founders needed a drink after work. They built the foundation of almost everything you consider civilized today. And then they vanished. Their cities buried under sand for thousands of years, their language forgotten so completely that for over 2 millennia, no human being on earth could read a single word they wrote. Today, we're going back to the beginning, not the beginning of history, the beginning of written history, because before this civilization there was no such thing. And this is the truth behind the Sumerians. Around 4,500 BCE in what is now southern Iraq, a region called Sumer sat between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Greeks would later call this whole area Mesopotamia, literally, the land between rivers. It sounds idyllic. It wasn't. The land flooded unpredictably. Summers were brutally hot. There was barely any rainfall. On paper, this should have been one of the worst places on earth to build a civilization. And yet the Sumerians didn't just survive here. They built something unprecedented. Because when your environment refuses to cooperate, you either die out or you get inventive. They chose inventive. They dug irrigation canals to control the floodwaters. They built levees. They organized labor on a scale no group of humans had attempted before. Because moving that much earth, coordinating that many workers, required something new, administration, and administration requires records, which is where our story really begins. Around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE, in the city of Uruk, Sumerian officials faced a very unglamorous problem. How do you keep track of who owes how much grain, or how many sheep were traded, or how much beer a temple worker was owed as payment? Their solution was cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. It started as pictographs, simple pictures representing objects. A drawing of a jar meant a jar. A drawing of a head and a bowl together meant to eat. Over centuries, these pictures became abstract wedge shapes, and something remarkable happened. The symbols stopped representing just objects and started representing sounds. That shift from this symbol means a cow to this symbol means a sound in my language is arguably one of the most important cognitive leaps in human history. It's the moment human thought became something you could store outside a human brain. Before this, if you wanted to know something, you needed a person who remembered it. After this, knowledge could outlive the person who wrote it down. And it's worth sitting with the irony here. The first writing in human history wasn't poetry. It wasn't prayer. It wasn't a declaration of love or a philosophical treatise. It was a receipt. Literally, the earliest cuneiform tablets we've found are administrative and economic records, inventories, tax accounts, beer rations. Human civilization's first written words were essentially, "This guy owes us 29 sheep." Once you can write things down, you can do something else new. You can write down rules and expect people to actually follow them, because now there's a permanent record everyone can be held to. The Sumerians produced what's widely considered the oldest known law code in human history, the Code of Ur-Nammu, dating to around 2100 BCE. This predates the far more famous Code of Hammurabi by roughly 3 centuries, and what's striking about it is how recognizable it is. It includes laws about property, marriage, assault, even early forms of monetary compensation for injury. Instead of an eye for an eye, it often specified paying a fine in silver, which tells you something important. This wasn't a primitive, brutal society groping in the dark. This was a society already grappling with the same core question every legal system since has faced. How do you make punishment proportional? And how do you make a promise enforceable when the person you made it to isn't standing in front of you anymore? The answer they landed on was the same one we still use today. put it in writing, and back it with an institution powerful enough to enforce it. Somewhere around 3500 BCE, also likely in Sumer, another invention appears in the archaeological record, the wheel. Not for chariots at first, the earliest wheels were probably used for pottery, spinning clay to shape it evenly. Only later did someone realize you could turn that spinning disc sideways and put it under a cart, and the cities themselves were engineering feats in their own right. Uruk, at its peak, may have had a population of 40,000 to 80,000 people, making it possibly the largest city on Earth at the time. It had massive defensive walls, a temple complex dedicated to the goddess Inanna, and organized neighborhoods. At the center of Sumerian city life was the temple, the ziggurat, a massive stepped structure that functioned as both a religious center, essentially, the local bank, warehouse, and government office rolled into one. Priests didn't just perform rituals, they managed grain stores, organized labor, oversaw trade, and, crucially, kept the records that required all that writing we just talked about. Religion and bureaucracy weren't separate. They were the same institution wearing two hats. The list of Sumerian firsts is almost absurd once you start compiling it. The first known epic story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which includes a flood narrative that predates the biblical account of Noah by well over 1,000 years. The first schools, called adubas, literally tablet houses, where young scribes trained for years, copying text over and over to master the hundreds of cuneiform signs. The first known complaint letter to customer service, if you can believe it. A Babylonian-era tablet, in a tradition inherited from Sumerian record-keeping, where a customer complains that the copper he received was the wrong grade. The first known 60-based counting system, which is exactly why we still divide an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds, thousands of years later. Every time you check a clock, you're using a piece of Sumerian mathematics. So how does a civilization this foundational just disappear? It's not one single collapse, it's a slow erosion across centuries. Sumerian city-states were frequently at war with each other, weakening themselves through internal conflict long before any outside force arrived. There's also a theory rooted in the land itself. Centuries of irrigation without adequate drainage caused salt to build up in the soil, a process called salinization. Some historians argue that Sumerian agricultural texts show a documented shift over time, from wheat to the more salt-tolerant barley, suggesting their own farming methods were slowly poisoning the land that fed them. Around 2004 BCE, the last significant native Sumerian dynasty, the third dynasty of Ur, collapsed under pressure from the Elamites and other invading groups. Power shifted to the Akkadians, then the Babylonians and Assyrians, who absorbed Sumerian culture, religion, and writing, rather than erasing it. And that's the key detail. The Sumerians didn't vanish through some dramatic apocalypse. Their language stopped being spoken day to day, but their writing system, their laws, their myths, and their gods were absorbed into the very Babylonian and Assyrian cultures that followed. Sumerian became something like Latin would become millennia later. A dead language still used for religious and scholarly texts, long after ordinary people stopped speaking it at home. Eventually, even that faded. By around the 1st century AD, the ability to read cuneiform was essentially extinct. The knowledge of an entire civilization, the people who arguably invented writing itself, was completely lost. For over 1,800 years, Sumer didn't exist. Not in memory, not in scholarship, not even in myth. Their cities were buried under desert sand. Nobody on Earth remembered their name. It wasn't until the 19th century that archaeologists excavating in Mesopotamia began uncovering tablet after tablet of this strange, wedge-shaped script. Scholars spent decades slowly, painstakingly decoding cuneiform, using bilingual inscriptions similar to how the Rosetta Stone unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphs. And when they finally cracked it, they didn't just find a forgotten language. They found the root system underneath law, religion, mathematics, and administration, as we still practice them today. The Sumerians remind us of something uncomfortable. Civilizations that consider themselves permanent are, historically speaking, the exception, not the rule. Empires that seem invincible in their moment can be so thoroughly forgotten that humanity has to rediscover them centuries later, piece by piece, from clay in the dirt. But they also remind us of something else. Ideas outlast the people who create them. The Sumerians are gone. Their language is dead. Their cities are dust. But their inventions, writing, law, the wheel, the 60-second minute, never disappeared at all. History changes. Human patterns remain. This has been the truth behind the story.